So, Ambassador, this month marked the 7-year anniversary of Myanmar military committing a clearance operation against Rohingya Muslim in northern Rakhine State, which caused exodus of refugees. And this United States designated as this action as this crime and action as genocide. So 7 years on, we still don't have any prospect of bringing justice to the Rohingya. So what do you think are the prospects for bringing justice for Rohingya as right now?
Well, thank you so much for covering this issue. It's extremely important. Indeed, it doesn't appear to be that there are prospects for justice, but I want to emphasize how much work is being done behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. So there are multiple cases now before multiple courts that are considering the question of harm to Rohingya, in particular under the Genocide Convention. So as you know, the International Criminal Court has opened an investigation into this matter. That is ongoing. We have not yet seen arrest warrants issued, but I know that those teams are working. We also have a very interesting case that the Gambia, which is a West African nation, brought against Myanmar under the Genocide Convention before the International Court of Justice, which is also in The Hague. An individual Rohingya went to The Hague and were able to testify. I have met with those survivors, and the experience of telling a panel of international judges what they experienced from 2016 and 2017 with those clearance operations, and also just how difficult their lives have been now in Cox's Bazar, was an incredibly transformative experience for those individuals. We also know that individual investigations have been opened in several states around the world, most notably in Argentina. These cases are proceeding under what we call universal jurisdiction, which basically says that any state of the world can pursue charges against individuals who stand accused of international crimes. So while we haven't had any verdicts or judgments yet, trust that work is being done in various courts around the world.
So we recently see International Criminal Court, ICC, has issued warrant against Russian President Vladimir Putin. We haven't seen such swift action against Myanmar military leader, and despite its ongoing atrocity and deteriorating situation. So what do you think it would take to get equal attention and focus on Rohingya issues and crisis in Myanmar?
I know that the prosecutor is working hard on this case. One major difference is that in the Ukraine situation, the prosecutor had access to the territory where those war crimes and other atrocities are happening. They've been able to open a field office in Ukraine to send investigators to do firsthand investigations. Obviously, the territory of Myanmar is not available to the International Criminal Court or to its personnel, so they have to work on the margins. They do have access to Cox's Bazar, and they have been there several times and have done interviews with survivors. So that work is ongoing, and I imagine that we will see action before the ICC very soon. We also have the United Nations has established an independent international investigative team that is solely focused on Myanmar. One team is dedicated to the genocide against Rohingya. The second team is looking at crimes committed since the coup in 2021. So they're actively building a body of evidence that then can be shared with investigators and prosecutors around the world.
Do you think international response to Rohingya is failing? Or if you think so, why?
I don't think it's failing, but it's an extremely difficult situation. The United States has spent and has provided millions and millions of dollars in humanitarian assistance to support the host countries, including Bangladesh, to provide humanitarian assistance to Rohingya. But because the war is ongoing in Myanmar and because that country is now fracturing, the government, as you know, controls less and less territory. And there are a number of different groups that are ascendant, and they're having conversations amongst themselves about what a future inclusive democratic Myanmar looks like. But because that's the case, we can't, there's only so much we can do with respect to the territory. So the hope now, I think, with the new government in Bangladesh is that we can provide greater humanitarian assistance to Cox's Bazar when we have the opportunity for those individuals to return home. But they cannot do so until it is safe, until they are returning home voluntarily, and until there is a sustainable plan for them to restart their lives in their ancestral homelands.
So as we speak, we witness a second wave of violence and Rohingya refugees fleeing to Bangladesh. But this time, the atrocity, the crimes are not committed by the Myanmar military. Instead, it's committed by ethnic armed group, which is Arakan army, which is controlling more and more territory in Rakhine State. So, do you think the crime that occurring to Rohingya right now is amount to genocide?
It's difficult to say. It's hard to get information out of the situation because it's still so raw now. It's still so current. We do know that atrocities are being committed, and that because the violence has risen, it's inevitably the civilian population, civilian communities of multiple ethnic groups that are the ultimate sufferers of this situation. So we have called upon the parties to commit to more comprehensive efforts at a ceasefire, and the hope is that eventually they will be able to have a more peaceful situation so that Myanmar can return to the path of democracy. But this government is unwilling to relinquish power at this point, and so we see these continual acts of violence and atrocities.
We see Myanmar military is in losing strait, and the more and more ethnic armed groups are controlling more and more territory in Myanmar. As we speak, like the expert in human rights, they are warning there could be like a surge in a human rights violation. And what kind of message would you like to convey to these leaders of ethnic armed group in Myanmar?
I would emphasize that they need to distinguish themselves from the Tatmadaw. The Tatmadaw, throughout its history, has been characterized by violence, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide against Rohingya. Everywhere that those militaries are deployed, the ethnic armed groups, if they want to build legitimacy in the eyes of the international community, if they want to be a part of the solution, they need to strictly adhere to the laws of war. They need to show to the Myanmar people that they are different from the Tatmadaw, not that they are the same as the Tatmadaw. So that would be my key message. If they want to build legitimacy, they have to show that they can operate within the confines of international law, treat civilian communities with respect and dignity, treat individuals in their custody humanely, even members of the Tatmadaw, and ultimately work towards a democratic future for Myanmar.
Okay. So what can you tell me about ongoing U.S. support to Rohingya and U.S. policy about bringing justice for Rohingya and humanitarian assistance?
As I mentioned, we've provided millions and millions of dollars towards humanitarian assistance in Cox's Bazar, but also in other areas where Rohingya have sought refuge. But we're also very supportive of multiple justice efforts. So we have provided financial assistance to the international mechanism I mentioned that's conducting investigations and operating as a clearinghouse of evidence that is available to courts around the world to bring cases. We're also helping to fund documentation to international standards, so local documentation groups can feed their interviews, their documents, their analyses into the international system of justice and contribute to cases proceeding before the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, or in national courts around the world. So we're highly focused on empowering and strengthening the ability of Myanmar local civil society groups to do this work and to be a part of a larger justice community so that these cases can proceed eventually. The real challenge is always custody over the accused. In some systems, those systems can proceed in absentia, which means they don't have the defendant present. But at the International Criminal Court, they can't go much farther than an application for an arrest warrant and the issuance of an arrest warrant without the individual in custody. So while those senior members of the Tatmadaw remain within Myanmar and then control that territory, it will be difficult for those cases to proceed. But those prosecutors and investigators are ready. They have dossiers on responsible individuals. They have pages and pages of documentation. I was briefed yesterday by the IIMM, which is this international investigative mechanism, about how much information they are gathering with respect to the genocide against the Rohingya, but also crimes committed since the coup in 2021.
As I talked to, with regard to humanitarian assistance, I talked to one of the Rohingya activists, and she suggested she'd like to see humanitarian assistance going to the Rohingya who left in Myanmar, who are also similar dire circumstance in refugee camps and in squalid condition. So do you think that could be realistic or possible?
Yeah, obviously the need is enormous inside the country. We have good access to Bangladesh, and I give great credit even to the prior administration within Bangladesh to enabling humanitarian assistance to come in. Obviously, more work needs to be done, and the new interim government has expressed its support for that. Providing humanitarian assistance inside Myanmar is much more of a challenge. We don't have access to the territory, right? We don't necessarily have access to cross-border points where that assistance can come in. So it's just much more difficult to do that work. But I want to acknowledge how dire the situation is, and we need to look for creative solutions.
There are also interests and maybe even concern. What kind of impact, what kind of change it will bring if there's a U.S. administration change here in Washington? What do you think?
Well, what I can say is that support for Rohingya, the aspirations of the Myanmar people, all ethnic and religious groups, it is a bipartisan issue. There are Republicans and Democrats that agree that U.S. policy should be supporting the return of Myanmar to a democratic pathway and supporting efforts of justice on behalf of Rohingya and other survivors of atrocities. We also know there's a great amount of support for the National Unity Government in the hope that they can create a truly inclusive and participatory and multi-ethnic, multi-religious consortium and coalition of groups to chart that path forward. They have issued a transitional justice policy. It's still under consideration. It's subject to consultation with experts, with communities across the government, across the country. And so they are very committed to ensuring that justice is a big piece of their platform when a democratic government is able to return to Myanmar. So regardless of the outcome of the election, I know that there's strong bipartisan support for all of these issues. And I can't imagine that U.S. policy would change at all.
Okay. So finally, in your role as an ambassador for global criminal justice at State Department, so what kind of advice would you like to give to the U.S. government in prevention and response to genocide and ethnic cleansing and all the war crime against Rohingya and other ethnic groups or in Myanmar?
I would hope that we would stay the course, continue supporting all of these various efforts, look for ways to provide additional assistance to cases that are proceeding at the ICC, at the ICJ, and in national courts. We've been able to provide discrete assistance to some of these efforts, and I'd like to see that continue and even ramp up even more.